everybody's mixed up.
Okay.
Everybody sees a different mix.
Right. I know. Isn't that crazy? All right. I've got you all on gallery now. So this will be easier. Okay, Jill, you want to start? You're in the left corner here. So.
All right. My name is Jill Hinton. I'm glad to see everyone here, and we're very anxious to have Amy speak with us. I've been at St. Andrew about 22 years and love to do these classes.
Great. Thank you for having me. All right, Jerry Butler, you're up next.
Yeah, so most of y'all know me. I'm Jerry, Pastor Jerry, and I'm the pastor of discipleship at St. Andrew. Just recently moved here last year from Texas. So have been at St. Andrew about a year. Yeah, and that's me. So me in a nutshell.
Oh, good to meet you.
Yep.
And Anne?
Well, if we're saying how long, I've been at St. Andrews since 73, you can do the math. So I've been here a long time, and I just love the things that we get to learn, and I'm excited to see what you tell us about good old Jonah.
Yeah, well, yeah, unfortunately, I have pages and pages to say about the topic, apparently. I sent Jill the link to the book that I wrote on Jonah that's coming out, and it's 500 pages it's clocking in on. And this is the English version. You wouldn't even get 2 full pages. So the fact that there's that much to say, yeah, we could be here a while. All right, Sue's up next.
Hi, Amy. It's good to be here. I've been at St. Andrew for 15 years, and I'm excited to hear from you and learn as much as you can teach us.
Excellent. Thank you for indulging me with these introductions. It feels so much less weird if I feel like I know you. All right, Christine. Well, it says you're Christine and Sophie, but I only see.
Yeah, well, Sophie's the dog, and she'll be making an appearance when I least expect it.
Oh, good.
I'm happy to be here. I've been with St. Andrew for, I guess, 15 or plus years, and I love these scholar classes. I'm thankful to Jill for organizing them. I'm looking forward to being with you for 3 weeks.
Thank you. And Chris's iPad is next.
Who'd you say?
You, Chris.
Oh, okay. I'm Chris Harper. I'm actually a Presbyterian, but I hang out with Methodists a lot.
Ooh, scandalous.
I
Excellent.
mean, nobody's perfect, Chris, but we'll let you stay. So
I was educated by Presbyterians, so.
What? What'd you say?
I was educated by Presbyterians. I did my MDiv at a Presbyterian seminary, and I did my PhD at a Presbyterian seminary. So
I only did my MDiv at a Presbyterian seminary.
Okay.
I have a PhD. I've got a doctorate in law, but not in religion.
Excellent. All right, Susie, hi.
Hi, I'm Susie Malik. I've been at St. Andrew about 13 years, and we've met before when you used to come on Sunday morning. I was on Pathways with Tam.
Yeah.
So I've known you for a while.
Oh, I know. That was so nice. I mean, I'm glad to be here with you here. With you.
Yeah, then I said, oh, good. I haven't seen her in a long time. And when I saw you were going to have a presentation.
Great. Well, thank you for being here. Appreciate the endorsement. Okay, let's see who's next. Penny?
Yeah, Penny, Panay, whatever.
Hey, okay.
Whatever. So I've been at St. Andrew 5+ years, and I also have a hugely Presbyterian background.
Excellent. Well, the Presbyterians, I don't know, maybe Jerry will correct me, but the Presbyterians have a closer relationship with the Bible than I think the Methodists traditionally do. And St. Andrews is always kind of crossing that line because there have been at least way more interested in Bible stuff than most Methodists are. So,
I would go with that. Yep.
Okay. Joan?
I'm Joan Chase. I'm not a member of St. Andrew, but I've availed myself of the church's courses over many years. I'm also an ILF graduate way back when you had a degree in biblical interpretation.
Really? Wow, that's great. Who was there? Was Kent Richards there at the time?
Who?
Kent Richards?
Don't remember him, but Mark was there and
Oh, good. Okay. And Pam.
Pam. Yes, I was struggling for her name.
Yeah.
A lot of people you know were there.
Sure. Excellent. And Terry. Oh, Terry's muted. Somebody has to do it.
Okay, sorry about that. You'd think by now I've learned.
No, somebody has to take the hit.
Okay. I'm Terry Ingram, and I've been here about 3 years, and I really enjoy all the classes and everything. So thank you so much for being here.
Good. Happy to be here. Okay. Missy. There she goes.
There we go. I'm Misty Bryan, and my family and I have been a part of St. Andrew for coming on 18 years. And I'd have to say my favorite thing first is I just want to thank Pathways so much for just knocking it out of the park, always, but especially during this pandemic. But my favorite part about learning is I just remember when I was in college at CU and all these old people would be at the back of the class and they would be auditing the class just for fun. And I thought, oh, someday that's exactly what I want to do. No tests, no papers, no projects, just the fun learning part. So now I'm that old person at the back of the class, and it's fun.
Wait. I can't wait. Thanks for being here. Steve.
Thank you.
Steve Baska.
Oh, I think that was me.
Hi.
Hello, I'm Steve. I have been at St. Andrew about 8 years, and I'm on the education team with Jill. And I like Bible topics and fish stories, so I figured Jonah was a good candidate.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Well, we have fish all over the house. So not only does everyone give me something to do with a whale or Jonah for my birthday or for Christmas, but we're also fly fishers, my partner and I. So we also
too.
Excellent. So there
Lots of crossovers.
Crossover. There we go. Excellent.
Thanks for doing this.
Sure. Sharon, hi. Uh-oh.
He's muted.
Unmute Sharon.
There I had it. Okay, I'm Sharon Burbank, and I've been at St. Andrew about probably 4 years now, and I enjoy the Pathways educational opportunities, and I'm learning so much, and thank you for being here.
Great, good. Nancy.
Hi, I'm Nancy Ward. I've been at St. Andrew for almost 30 years. And usually in the bell choir and the choir. And so it's kind of nice to be able to take classes even on Monday nights. So I'm looking forward to learning about Jonah.
Good. Okay, Susan is up next on my screen. You guys get no warning, right?
Hi, I'm Susan Hartley. I'm Presbyterian also. And I know Jill and a couple of other people from St. Andrews that have gone to some of the classes and special worship events. But I live in Colorado Springs. But I heard from Kathleen that you were doing this. And so I was interested and I'm glad to be here.
Nice.
I went to McCormick. I don't know where you went.
Oh, okay. I went to Columbia and then to Princeton.
Okay. So we covered the.
Yeah, we got it covered.
We got it covered.
Well, good. Well, thanks for coming.
Well, I'll throw in my plug. I went to San Francisco and graduated from Austin.
Oh,
all right. Well, we've covered everybody just about.
Now we got both coasts and everything.
We're lacking 5 of them.
Okay. Good. Well, you all can keep me honest with your degrees and such, you know.
Oh, we're just glad to be here.
Thanks. Gary, hello.
Hi, Gary Wiseman. I've been at St. Andrews since the late 70s. my wife and I, and a lot of disciple Bible classes, and looking forward to learning at this class. Thank you.
Jennifer?
Hi, I'm Jennifer Meyer. I've been a member of St. Andrew for the last 3 years, and I am always fascinated to take classes that involve folks from ILIF, so that's always fun. And I also have a lot of interest in the power of fable and myth and folk legend, so I'm interested to see the connections you're going to make.
Awesome. Good, good. Alan?
I'm Alan Doy from Virginia. I've never been to St. Andrews. I was introduced to this community by Christine and Sophie down a little bit further down the list. And this is the second class I think I've sat in on, and I've enjoyed it. So I've been looking forward to this.
Oh, good. Welcome. And Eugene? It's just an E, so I don't know. Maybe he wants to hide behind his screen. Okay, maybe the people who have their...
Yes, yes, I'm sorry.
And this one.
Yes,
That one.
Okay. Sorry for the blackout. I was getting a quick bite to eat. Jean Dawson, wife and I, Mary, have been St. Andrews, oh my goodness, about 5 years, I think, thereabouts. And even at St. Andrews when I was down in DeCoven Park. I have a degree from Andover Newton Theological School now at Yale, and
excellent,
and Boston University School of Social Work PhD from Syracuse. But I'm most interested in, as the person before stated, how you're linking fable and folk stories in the Bible, and the Bible is certainly most important and central to our faith. I'm an American Baptist by background, but half the time I've been with the United Methodist Church, so I'm a hybrid, I guess. I'm a hybrid. But anyway, thank you. Thank you. Sorry for the disruption there I caused. Thank you.
No worries, no worries. My dad did his DMin at Andover Newton, so.
Oh, really? My goodness.
Yeah.
All work.
Back in the day. So.
Oh, yes.
Oh, Keith, hello.
You have to take out your voice now.
Say Keith, Amy?
Yes.
Okay, hi. Keith Ferguson, my wife and I have been part of St. Andrews since 1985. I had black hair or brown hair when I joined the church. So, you know, been around for a while, and good to see a number of familiar faces. Amy, I was interested in the class. I first studied the book of Jonah in college with was one of my few social humanistic classes I had as an engineer. And it was a great books class. I thought it was a fascinating story with a lot of meaning to it. Actually been working on writing a sacred oratorio for a number of years. And Jonah is one of the characters that is part of that.
Oh, excellent.
Thing that I'm writing. So here to learn more about Jonah.
Good, good. All right. And then to the people who not have their videos up, do you not want to say hello, or it's okay if you want to hide?
Well, I can say hello. I'm Ilse Dawes. I've only been with St. Andrew for 2 years, but I am really in gratitude for the speakers, the guest speakers they present from ILIF, because those people do their homework, they dig, and they bring stuff to the forefront that when you read it yourself, you completely miss.
Thank you. Good, good. And Cindy is the last box on my screen.
Oh.
There she is.
Cindy Grandman, and I've been going to St. Andrew off and on for over 30 years, and in several classes, and really enjoy them. And this topic sounds interesting, and I'm glad to be here.
Great, great. Thank you for indulging me. I know that most of you know each other, but it really is weird to not know who you're talking to. And since we're going to have 3 sessions together, I really wanted to take that time.
Well, shall I introduce you?
Oh, right. Okay, sure.
Okay. So I will just read what I wrote. Tonight we welcome Dr. Amy Erickson. Dr. Erickson is with the Aleph School of Theology, where she is Associate Professor of Hebrew Bible and the Director of the Masters of Theological Studies at Aleph. She will talk to us about her some ideas from her new book concerning how we will interpret the book of Jonah. Her book on the topic will be released on May 18th, and I'll be sending you the link for that the next time I send you an email, which is probably next Sunday. So without further ado, let's have Amy tell us about Jonah.
Okay, great. So I would just...
Oh, one more thing. Everybody mute, please, except Amy.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm assuming that you're going to be okay with a little experimentation in terms of the format. So I don't know exactly where we're going to want to go, and if people don't feel comfortable chiming in the large group, maybe we can break into smaller groups later, but we'll start out all together and see how the conversation flows. Sometimes my students, especially the first time they come into a Zoom classroom, they all hide behind their mute buttons. And so sometimes to get the conversation flowing, I have to force them into smaller groups. So I thought maybe if you all are open, I might just talk for 20 minutes or so to try to introduce my work, introduce the topic, help you think about reading Jonah from a different perspective, and to point you to some of the big and interesting questions that I think the book raises. Sound good? And eventually I'm even going to share my screen and try to do a PowerPoint, which is way harder than walking and chewing gum at the same time, but we'll see how that goes. Okay, so I want to frame our time together with Jonah around stories of how people over time and in different communities have read and interpreted the book. And I want to do this in part because there is a particular interpretation, what has emerged as the dominant interpretation, that has gained a kind of intractable foothold, not only in churches, but also in scholarship. And I zero in on this because I think that not just this particular reading, this dominant reading, but reading in this way with all of the embedded assumptions that go along with it has unintended negative consequences in and for mainline churches. So this means that just to start, I'm going to talk a little less about the particulars of Jonah and more about how we read and how we might read Jonah differently. So if you like jargon, those of you with your degrees from seminaries, we're going to talk about a little bit about hermeneutics. So if you think, let me just preface this also by saying, if you think Jonah means in the way that I am about to disparage, you might take comfort in the fact that before I started writing a book on the topic, I assumed many facets of the dominant reading. And I taught this interpretation to my students until I started digging in. So maybe I'm particularly passionate about exposing the problems with it because I myself was duped by it. So the interpretation goes, Jonah is an obstinate prophet of the Lord who does not want to proclaim a message of salvation to non-Jews, especially his enemies. Over the course of the book, God pushes Jonah to see the light, that God's love and mercy extends to everyone, not just the Jews. And the Gentiles in Nineveh are either incredibly spiritually enlightened and repent of their evil ways after 5 words from Jonah, or they repent in this crazy over-the-top way to show up in fantastic relief Jonah's obstinacy, his failure to repent and submit to God. Either way, these Gentiles get God, the true God, in a way that Jonah simply does not. So Jonah ultimately fails to see that God could go so far as to forgive Israel's enemies. Indeed, this reading understands even Jonah's prayer from the fish belly to be a hypocritical performance. In fact, so revolting and sickening is Jonah's false piety that the whale vomits him out onto dry ground. Okay, so that's the dominant interpretation. Nod your head if this sounds like something you've heard before. Yeah, good. So this interpretation has real appeal, especially to Christians who like the idea of a universally loving God who is slow to punish and anger and feel sort of uncomfortable with the notion of the particular that runs through great swaths of the Hebrew Bible. So forms of this dominant reading have been around for a very long time, like back to the 3rd, 4th century, long time. But about 20 years ago, scholars started to get in touch with their sense of humor, which is saying something, if you're Presbyterian or, or worse. So straight-faced readings of Jonah gave way to an explosion of readings highlighting the book's comic and satiric elements. This sounds great. So I am all for humor in the Bible, and I'm certainly not going to advocate for a humorless reading of Jonah. That is definitely not something I think would be good for anyone. But actually, these readings reinforced the dominant reading in new ways and lent it even more appeal, because the assumption behind these funny readings is that if the text is a satire, it must be rejecting something, showing some position to be funny, as in like funny ludicrous. So the logic goes, the satire satirizes Jonah and all that he stands for. Interesting thing about this is that readers are more than happy to laugh at Jonah, but rarely at God. But what critics are actually doing when they cast Jonah as the sole target of the satire is revealing, I think, a deep prejudice against the other, namely the Jew, and anxiety about the presence of the Jew. So we hear scholars indicting Jonah for being too narrow-minded, too stubborn, too disobedient, too xenophobic, basically too stereotypically Jewish. So I want to disrupt the strategy behind this reading that seeks to keep the Jew or the other at arm's length, to learn nothing from Jonah, the other in our textual midst, as we, like God and us, all cozy, laugh about how we know better. So this way of reading is problematic for a number of reasons. And I would argue it doesn't just happen with Jonah or even just with the Bible. In fact, I want to suggest that it serves as an exemplar of the dominant way of reading scripture in mainline Protestant churches in general. I'm sure you all at St. Andrews are much more sophisticated than this, but it does tend to be a default way of reading. But I think it actually goes against many of the implied and even stated commitments of more progressive churches, especially progressive churches with more postmodern leanings. So specifically, why do I think it's problematic? One, counter to many liberal expressions of theology, it suggests that there is one right way to read Jonah. And if there's one right way to read, it suggests that there is one way to salvation, one way to be good Christians, one way to imagine marriage or partnerships. So we know that we're against those things, but when we run into a dominant reading of scripture, we tend to have a hard time thinking about that in the same way that we think about other kinds of doctrinal issues. The bigger problem, and now, I'm at the Iliff School of Theology, and we on the Bible faculty there have a long-standing and close relationship with the faculty who teach at the Center for Judaic Studies at the University of Denver. And Pam Eisenbaum is our resident New Testament scholar who is a Jewish scholar and brings to light particularly Jewish readings of the New Testament. So I'm really surrounded by and swimming in Jewish seas, basically. So that this was something that I became quite passionate about, trying to disrupt what I see as somewhat anti-Jewish readings. So the reason I say it's anti-Jewish is that the dominant reading laughs, I've suggested this, but it laughs sort of knowingly and sometimes pityingly at the selfish, obstinate Jonah, who must learn a lesson that we already know. In this way, Christian identity gets shored up against the Jew as the antithesis to the Christian. And it takes the Ninevites and turns them into the Gentiles, basically the proto-usses of the world, whom God is determined to save despite the protests of the small-minded Jew Jonah. So it makes the Christian reader feel confident in their knowledge that they are saved, that God actually loves us best, more than stupid little Jonah. So it assumes a chummy relationship between the Protestant worldview and God's message in Jonah. Just so happens that the God of Israel espouses exactly our values. It also shuts down imagination, this reading, and life-infusing struggling and wrestling with God, and in particular with the Jewish other in our midst. It reads from a secure position. There's an assumption that we already know what the book wants to tell us, right? There's an answer at the back of the book that white Protestants basically knew all along. But in the history of interpretation of Jonah, there are quite different readings of the book that developed and were nurtured on the margins, away from the power centers of Europe. And although there are amazing readings coming from contemporary marginalized community, for the most part, what drove my reading of Jonah, and where I want us to start tonight, is on pre-modern interpretations, especially from the Jewish corners of the world. So what's so fascinating about these readings is that marginalized communities are less likely to read in ways that confirm and reinforce the status quo that serves the center, because that does them no good, right? They're on the margins for a reason. They glorify the ambiguous and the unsettled because that's where they have a chance, where there's a chance for things to change. They see the cracks in dominant ideologies because that's how they've learned to read the terrain. That's how they have survived and enacted and coded their resistance. So rather than using the text to reinforce what is the status quo, marginal readers have used the text as a forum to air their fears and raise troubling questions, which, not unlike their lives, get played out without resolution. So such readings look at God's salvation of Nineveh, the capital of the empire that destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel. And they ask without flinching, is God siding with our enemies against us? Can we trust God to act in our interests? Is God even a good God? So where the dominant reading tends to take the difficult, raw theological questions raised by Jonah and answers them coherently and firmly, marginal interpretations take anxieties about God's protection and the waywardness of human life and stage them so that the community can wrestle with them. So rather than like text as security blanket, it becomes text as Rubik's Cube. It might not satisfy an essential yearning for comfort, but you can turn it and take delight in the way it intrigues you and discomforts you. So yeah, let me stop and see, are there questions from here? I want to make sure I don't lose anybody.
I just wanted to say that I never realized that I was marginalized until I heard your definition.
Yeah, what do you mean by that?
Well, I've always questioned everything, just the nature of who I am. So, you know, I look for the cracks and the holes and why it doesn't fit together the way it should, which is what you're saying your definition of marginalized view is.
Yeah, well, that is what comes out. So when you get often readings from the top, especially from the church, that do filter down or trickle down into congregations everywhere, I think they can often even reflect this view without even really questioning it because it's linked to a particular kind of worldview. So while I think that's right, individuals can say, well, I don't read that way. I like to ask the questions. I think that churches, structures, you know, the leaders, not you, Jerry, but, you know, leaders at the top of the denomination, people who are writing doctrine and that sort of thing, trying to keep a wraps on things, they tend to be less comfortable with these kinds of questioning readings. Now, this may not sound like I'm talking to you all in particular, because I know that you wouldn't be here if you weren't interested in asking weighty theological questions, but I want to get that reading out on the table and talk about why I don't like it and talk about what's more interesting in order to help us move forward and let go of it. Does that make sense? Thoughts, questions from there? Okay. All right. Let me point to a couple of principles that guide this reading of the text, and we can play with these or we can not play with these. I found it to be really fun. So when I was first asked to write this commentary on the book of Jonah, it's in a series. So, you know, they're editors and they invite people to do these sorts of things. And this is my advisor from Princeton who asked me to write this commentary. And I've been working on Job for years. My dissertation was on the book of Job. And he said, do you want to write on Jonah? And I was like, I don't want to write on like a children's story. You think I'm not, you think I'm that unsophisticated? I've been working on Job. This is like, you know, the sort of philosophical high point of the Hebrew Bible. And you want to bring me down to the level of Jonah? And he said, oh, it'll be great. It'll be great because there's so much interesting art and literature, because the series emphasizes the history of interpretation. You'll find a way into it. And yeah, so I just assumed the book was boring. I thought that reading about God's universal love for, you know, people other than Jews, what's interesting about that, you know? So it was exciting to me to find another way in, to find different principles of reading, to kind of organize my thoughts and go in more exciting directions. So let me just point to a couple of these principles. So this kind of a reading would begin first and foremost, perhaps with a sort of overcorrection in mind, with a concern to weight Jonah's voice. So typically we dismiss him out of hand as sort of a buffoon. So we're actually going to try to wonder, if you're working with me tonight, what he has to say. What kind of important questions does he raise? And this is kind of like the fool in Shakespeare's plays. You know, you kind of want to dismiss him because he's ridiculous, but he actually is the one who is raising the important questions, right? He's kind of the critic working from the side. So many of these pre-modern Jewish interpretations see Jonah as a highly developed character. And the result is an increase in friction between God and Jonah's positions. So in this way, Jonah emerges as more of a dialogical text. So we don't have to mock one perspective at the expense of the other. So subversive ideology and orthodox voice can coexist without one swallowing up the other. So I think in the book of Jonah, everyone gets teased. Maybe this reflects to some degree how I was raised. My family, everybody got teased, no exceptions. Well, except maybe my mother. She was sort of the God figure in the family. But when these interpreters laugh, they don't pick one side to ridicule. They laugh in ways that don't place themselves and their point of view above another object of mockery. So this is kind of diaspora style humor. It's very self-critical, so that as part of the humor, the Jews are making fun of themselves at the same time that they're making fun of their oppressors. So why don't we jump in to the text? Does that sound good? So I've got my slides so that we can see it in front of us. Although I imagine you can pull it up pretty easily, but I have nice art that goes with it. Now this is going to be weird because I'm going to pull it up and then I'm not going to be able to see you. So we'll try to manage this. Jill, do you share my screen? Do you give me permission to share my screen, or? Oh, I can do it. Excellent. She's already on it. Okay. So Now the problem here is if I make this full screen, then I can't see you. So if you need to get my attention, you're going to have to get off mute and speak, okay? Excellent. Okay. So we've already talked about Jewish readings, some weird readings, and then we've got some great images that I just want to show to help get your imagination flowing. This is an Islamic image, and that's just cool. Okay, so let's just look at the text, read it together, but I can't see the whole thing now because I've got, hang on. Pictures on the side. Hang on one second. There it is. Okay. All right. So the word of Yahweh came to Jonah, the son of Amittai. Now go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out concerning it, for their evil has come up before me. Then Jonah set out to flee to Tarshish, away from Yahweh. He went down to Joppa and found a ship coming from Tarshish. So he paid its hire and went down into it to accompany them to Tarshish, away from Yahweh. Okay, now I'm trying to get you all back again. This is going to be not possible. Okay, so you're just going to have to come off mute. Tell me what questions get raised here as you read this. What comes to mind? What questions? So one of the things about biblical texts, especially in the Hebrew Bible, is they contain what we call lots and lots of gaps. Lots of places, whoops. Oh boy. Well, that's weird. I'm trying to get back and it's not letting me do it. Okay. Well.
Check the lower left corner.
The lower left. There it is. Okay. All right. Sorry about that. This is a lot for me to handle all at once. Okay. So questions for you. Places to stand in this text, lots of them, lots of things that we don't have, that we're not told here.
Who's Jonah?
Who's Jonah? That's a great question. That's excellent. So anybody have thoughts?
Well, I wondered if he'd heard the word of God before.
Well, that is so interesting because that's exactly what Jewish readers thought. Pre-modern Jewish readers know about a text in 1 Kings that talks about Jonah, and they say this must be the same Jonah. Of course, right? Makes sense. Jewish readers also go so far as to assign Jonah a tribal designation. So they can't imagine that someone who is a Hebrew prophet, that we wouldn't know who his family is. We wouldn't know about his daddy or his mama. So they have a sort of interesting connections that they make based on this text in 1 Kings, because as we know, the Hebrew Bible is kind of an earthy book. Augustine talked about the carnal Jews, talked about the sort of fixation with genealogies and with the land and with familial connections. And that is exactly what the Jews are doing. So that later on Jewish scholars came to say, yeah, carnal Israel, exactly, that's us. So Jonah's one of ours. Jonah's part of the family. Absolutely, that's really good. Other thoughts, other questions? The other thing that's funny about this, right, is that the word of God just comes out of the blue. So we get no setup for Jonah. So in other prophetic books, there is some introduction to the prophet and where the prophet lives and where he's from and who he's interacting with, which king in particular he's interacting with. Here in Jonah, we're just dropped in, right? Word of the Lord came to Jonah. Boom, just like that.
Do we know where Tarshish is?
Where Tarshish is? Another good question. Does anybody have a response to that one?
It's in Turkey, isn't it?
We're not sure. We're not sure. So some people say, this is like saying he went to Timbuktu, or he took a ship coming from Timbuktu. So it's this kind of imaginary, somewhat far off place. But lots of people have argued that it is a real destination. But at least in the mind of the Israelite writers, this was a place that was like really, really, really far away.
But I think the point was it was the opposite direction from Nineveh.
Right. This too. Yes. Yes.
But we don't even know where he's starting.
Well, he went down to Joppa, which is in northern Israel.
But where did he start? Where did God call him from?
Yes, I know. So they're right out of the gates. You're sort of lifted out of the realia of the Hebrew Bible, which is, I was just lecturing this morning on this topic, almost always a landed proposition. So where you are in space, what land you are standing on is just a given in terms of how a story would be introduced or a character would be introduced. So we're in this kind of strange, already like unknown time and space. So that's the other thing. They don't tell us when in time we're talking about here. So again, most prophetic books will say in the 7th year of King Ahaz, or in the 8th year of King Hezekiah, or something like that. So-and-so a prophet, such and such a prophet was working and writing and that sort of thing. Here, again, nothing like that, which I think, so some of you mentioned your interest in fables and folk tales, immediately lets us know that this is a different kind of genre that we're dealing with here. This isn't your typical prophetic book. There's something sort of supra-historical about it, or fable-like about it. What else?
Do we know what particular kind of evil they were doing?
That is a great question too. So yeah, what on earth is going on here? So their evil has come up before me. Okay. God's usually a little more specific about what the problem is, right? And this will actually be a word, the word evil, that will come up in this chapter over and over and over again. But we don't know what exactly is going on in Nineveh, other than that Jonah, or that Jonah is supposed to call out about it, something, for their evil has come up before me. Good. What else?
But we also don't know why he wants to flee.
Jonah, right? Yeah.
Why his reaction is to flee.
Right. Right. Now, this has been a question that, I mean, every scholar who's written on the book of Jonah, every pre-modern interpreter, everybody out there wants to know, why is Jonah fleeing? When God tells you that you're supposed to do something, you're supposed to do it, right? But actually, what do we expect from prophets? When God says, here's a mission you are likely not going to be thrilled about, what do the prophets do? Do you all have a sense of this? I don't know.
Well, like Abraham goes wherever he's told to go.
That's true. That's true. What about other prophets? What about Moses?
Yep.
Can't talk right.
That's right. That's right. What about Jeremiah? He says, I'm only a little boy, right? I don't know how to say, and Moses says, I don't know how to speak. So the first thing a prophet is supposed to do, actually, to prove his mettle as a prophet, is to resist the call. So this is partly how you know that you're dealing with a real prophet here, because somebody who wants to go out and preach their own message for their own sake wouldn't say, no, I don't want to do this. So it's the writer's way of indicating to us that we're dealing with a true prophet here when we see that resistance mode. But Jonah, unlike Jeremiah, or unlike Moses or Isaiah, who says, my lips don't work very well, they're unclean. So God always comes up with a fix whenever these prophets try to fight back, right? So, I mean, poor Moses comes up with like 12 excuses, and God's like, no, I got it. You can't speak, we'll give you Aaron. It'll be fine, it'll be good. And yeah, so poor Isaiah has the unclean lips. So I got a hot coal that'll do just the trick for your unclean lips, Isaiah. So Jonah is almost saying, or the text is kind of communicating to us that Jonah is not even going to get involved in this. So he's going to resist, and it's going to be totally over the top. Almost like, yeah, you know that if you start dialoguing with God, start talking to God about how you don't want to go, you're going to end up going. So I wonder here if there are questions raised about what choice a prophet has. Does the prophet have free will? Does the prophet have agency in terms of prophesying? You know, so Jeremiah again raises these questions in his laments. So he's complaining constantly that he doesn't want to speak God's message because it gets him into boatloads of trouble. And he can't not speak it. So he says it's like a fire in my bones. I can't not speak God's word. So I feel like this is kind of the ultimate test of whether the prophet has the right to refuse. What else? So, oh, well, before we move on from that, why does he run away? So what's your response to that? Do you have thoughts? Because it's asking you to. The text is actually inviting you to stand and wonder that and posit something in response.
Does he not want to have anything to do with Gentiles?
Well, that's an interesting question, right? So that's what a lot of people posit, that he just is a Jew and he doesn't want to be around Gentiles. Does the text tell us that?
No.
No.
It doesn't. So we'd have to fill that based on our assumptions, right? What else? How else might we think about this question?
Well, how the heck does he think he can escape God anyway?
The rabbis had some ingenious solutions to this problem. You know, I mean, the rabbis have the most insanely creative readings you can imagine. But they said that there's a psalm that talks about God's presence on land and in the heavens and under the heavens, but it doesn't say that God's presence is at sea. And so Jonah knew this psalm, and so that's why he took a ship away from God, right? But it's interesting, in this text, we kind of assume that Jonah's problem is with Nineveh here initially. But the text kind of suggests that his problem is with God, because it says, Jonah set out to flee away from, and the Hebrew has the face of Yahweh. That's in verse 3, right? And then it repeats it. He went down into the ship to accompany them to Tarshish away from the face of Yahweh. So 2 times we hear that he's not necessarily running from Tarshish. He's trying, or he's not Tarshish. He's not running from Nineveh. He's running to Tarshish to try to get away from God. And I think this is where it's definitely supposed to be funny, right? Because of course we know this is not going to work. Which is why, you know, the book is inviting us to kind of adopt its light tone, even as it asks these big questions.
Well, I'll just posit the question. Maybe he thinks that if he disappears for a while, God will go to the next guy on the list.
Now that's a reasonable argument. Yeah, why not, right? What's so special about Jonah? Why does he have to be the one to go to Nineveh? Right? And what about this Nineveh business? Is this something, I'm sort of assuming that because you all are here, you've had some experience reading Bible, or you know a little bit about what's in there. But is this something prophets are asked to do, to go and prophesy in foreign nations? No.
No, I don't. Yeah, I was going to say, I don't think so. I can't think of one that prophesied outside of his own community.
Yeah, exactly. So this is kind of interesting because prophets will deliver what we call oracles against the nations. right? So they'll go on and on and on about how Babylon's going down, how Assyria is going down. They will excoriate these other nations within Israel. So the oracles against the nations are performed for Israel's benefit, to say, God is going to take care of our enemies. Don't you worry. The judgment against our oppressors is on the horizon. So I think one of the things that happens in the book of Jonah is that these tropes, these metaphors, these ideas from prophetic literature get what I'll call literalized in the book of Jonah. So the oracle against the nation is made real in a way that is absurd. So the idea that an Israelite prophet would go to Nineveh, which is the capital of the Assyrian Empire, and you want to talk about evil empire, this is the one. The idea that God would send Jonah there is laughable. The other thing that's kind of funny about this, so let's see if I can figure out how to turn this thing. Gosh, you'd think after teaching on Zoom for a year, I'd be comfortable with this, but too many things for the mind to worry about. Okay, so Jonah's name in Hebrew means dove, Yonah. And this psalm is, I think, an interesting, perhaps, allusion. It reads, "Fear and trembling came upon me, and horror overwhelms me. And I say, if only I had wings like a dove, I would fly away and be at rest. Truly, I would flee far away. I would lodge in the wilderness. I would hurry to find shelter for myself from the raging wind and tempest." So given that's Jonah's name, and this is one of the operative allusions, which takes lots, which in this psalm shares lots of vocabulary with Jonah. What's the significance of Jonah's name?
Fly away.
Yeah, and he wants to find shelter and rest. So it's key to kind of note this, because that's going to be important when we get to the next verses, when he goes down into the hold of the ship and he goes into the belly of the whale. He's constantly fleeing and seeking shelter from the raging wind, the ruach, and the tempest, the storm that God seems to be holding over his head almost constantly. So God in this relationship is not a welcome presence. This is not a relationship that Jonah wants to be in anymore. And there's something, as we continue to read through the text, that will be shocking about God's level of commitment. So Chris, I think it was you who said that Jonah's running away in the hopes that perhaps God will move on and find another prophet. Yep. You gotta wonder, you gotta wonder why God is going to such trouble with this guy. You know, I'm sure it would be easier to work with somebody else. And so there's something about their relationship, God's and Jonah's, that is a little creepy. You know, God's kind of a stalker in these texts. And also kind of heartwarming, because no matter how awful Jonah is, God says, no, this is what I need you to do. God is like pursuing him throughout the text. So he's not looking for the best prophet, the right prophet, a prophet who is going to submit to his will. He wants Jonah. And we don't know exactly why, right?
Jonah being a dove is a sacrifice in the temple.
That's right. A dove is also a sacrifice. And that's another aspect of the word that people have pointed to. So
a symbol of peace, a peace symbol. We usually think of doves as representing a symbol of peace.
Yeah, that too, which is kind of fun. So I think that thinking about the significance of names in the Hebrew Bible is fascinating, because all of these possibilities come into play as you appreciate different understandings of the word. Yeah, and you remember, of course, in the Noah story, Noah and the ark, Noah sends the dove off to find the green shoot. And we say, well, does that have anything to do with this text? Does that help us understand Jonah? There's another text in Hosea that says that basically criticizes doves for being kind of hysterical and fraidy cats. So they sit and coo when they're afraid, is Hosea's sort of indictment of the poor sweet dove, which later becomes, of course, a symbol of peace. So the other interesting thing about Jonah's name from the perspective of Christian interpretation is that the verb yana means to oppress, so that Yonah means oppressed one. Now, this is not really what the word means, but because it's kind of close, we call it a folk etymology. And that, especially for early Christian readers, stoked this connection between Jesus and Jonah. So there, especially in the early Christian period, in the art of the catacombs and on the art on sarcophagi, this is like in the Roman period, you see Jonah as a type of Christ, which is kind of cool. I mean, they find, you wouldn't believe the connection. Again, it's kind of like puzzling. So where's this next? Let's see.
Well, when you say that, it occurs to me that neither one has the ability to resist.
Yeah, say more. You mean
Well, a dove can't resist anything. All it can do is fly away.
Yeah.
And he's pressed into service the same way that Christ was. Please take this cup away from my lips.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Well, and then eventually we'll get there. We're not there yet, but the sailors will say, there's this terrible storm. Why has this storm come upon us? And Jonah eventually says, well, see, I'm fleeing my God, who is probably sent this storm to bring me back or to punish me or something along those lines. And he says to the sailors, sacrifice me, throw me overboard so that you can save yourselves. And the sailors quite nobly say, no, we don't really want to do that. But eventually they are persuaded that this is the only way to save themselves. So Christians, you can see in this image really clearly, have the sacrifice of Jesus paired with this image of Jonah being sacrificed into the mouth of the fish. And then they start to see a cross in the mast of the ship. And they depict that really clearly in certain sarcophagi, which are, burial, kind of like coffins that they used in the 2nd and 3rd centuries to bury their dead. So so there are, for Christians, clues all over the place that are significant in terms of understanding Jesus's place in this story. Thoughts, questions about that before I move on?
I do remember that the sign that would be given was the sign of Jonah.
Yes, exactly. Well, and we'll talk about that more next week when we talk about the poem or the psalm from the belly of the fish that Jonah speaks. But Matthew uses the sign of Jonah to talk about the resurrection of Jesus. So Jonah's in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights, just as Jesus was in the tomb. Now there's a little problem with the math here, not 3 days and 3 nights, but Matthew says close enough. And that's how we know that this death and resurrection, that sign from Jonah tells us about Jesus's resurrection, foreshadows it, prefigures it, is a type of Jonah's resurrection, of Jesus's resurrection, Jonah's too. And you can see in this one, the same images.
Well, it also shows the baptismal font.
Yes, exactly. Say more.
Well, it's talking about the baptismal liturgy. Sometimes talks about dying with Jesus to being reborn in a new life.
Yes, absolutely. Well, and again, this is what you get initially on the walls of these catacombs. You have Jonah first sacrificed into the mouth of the fish. Then you have Jonah being regurgitated from the mouth of the fish. And then you have him resting under a vine. And yes, you have all of these images of baptism around these images of Jonah. So not only is Jonah a type of Christ, but Jonah is a type of believer. Oh, and the other thing is when he's standing in the boat, he's standing like this, and this is the posture of an orange, which is a praying person. And also eventually gets more into even like a cross-like position in some boats in order to make that connection with Christ again. But the movement into the water and then out of the water into a position of repose in these Christian catacombs indicates or suggests that this is the journey of the believer into the waters of death to be reborn into a new life. And then again, you also get Jonah. So he's in all of these images naked, reclining under this vine, imagined as a new Adam, as Christ is imagined as a new Adam. So this typological, we call it a typological way of reading, or allegorical, maybe is more a familiar term to you all, where these parallels between the stories of Jesus and Jonah are incredibly important, and they structure the readings of Christians. Other thoughts, questions there?
It's a good thing that the Jews put the book of Jonah in for the Christians later on.
Yeah, that's right. I know. What fun would we have otherwise? Excellent. All right. So let's look at this next one. We'll move into the next verses. I can't really see it on my screen, so I'm going to have to read it off the Bible, because then I won't be able to see at least 4 faces. Okay, but the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, and such a mighty storm came upon the sea that the ship threatened to break up. Now I've got NRSV here, right? Okay, I don't have my own translation. I don't know why. Anyway, you think after all that work, I'd at least put my own translation up here. All right, so the ship threatened to break up. Then the sailors were afraid, and each cried to his God. They threw the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten it for them. Jonah, meanwhile, had gone down into the hold of the ship and had laid down and was fast asleep. The captain came and said to him, "What are you doing sound asleep? Get up, call on your God. Perhaps the God will spare us a thought so that we do not perish." Thoughts and questions?
How could Jonah be asleep in a storm?
Right, he didn't seem concerned at all.
No, it's very strange, isn't it? Ideas?
Jesus was asleep.
Exactly. So this is going to be a theme that gets picked up, or a motif that gets picked up in the New Testament. That has a slightly, I mean, you get a slightly different interpretation with Jesus there, right? But yeah, what's with you sleeping? I mean, the sailor's like, what is going on here? So, I mean, this is really a great place for us to speculate. So what is going on with Jonah? All of the sailors are up on deck doing everything they can to try to deal with this storm, and Jonah is gone. I mean, what does this suggest about Jonah's attitude toward his mission that he has tried to reject, and his attitude toward running away from it?
He's hiding from it.
Yes, I think that's right. So this idea of the dove seeking refuge, Jonah is going down. The other word that repeats in this first chapter is the Hebrew word yarad, which means to go down. So Jonah makes a number of moves downward, the ultimate one being down toward the gates of the netherworld, which he will speak in chapter 2 when he's in the belly of the fish. But some people have suggested that maybe this downward movement is an attempt to get, again, as far away from God as he possibly can. So while the Israelites were pretty sure that God was going to be able to find you on the sea, in the underworld, God was probably not going to be able to find you there, because God was thought to be a God of life. And the Israelites were a little hesitant to claim that God was present in the underworld. That happens eventually, but certainly in the Hebrew Bible, there's not an assumption that God is present in the underworld. So as he goes down and he sleeps, this is that word that describes Adam's deep sleep in the Garden of Eden. So when God goes to perform surgery in order to create Eve, he puts Adam into a deep sleep, a radam. And this is what Jonah has entered into in the hold of the ship. So he's basically in a coma, I think, and you could argue, hoping to die. And given that in chapter 4, he's going to say twice that he would rather die than work for Yahweh, he seems to be, at least it's arguable, that he's on a suicide mission here.
The way you say it, it doesn't sound like a self-induced sleep.
What's that? It doesn't sound like a
self-induced. In other words, he just went to sleep. Like the one then when you were referring to Adam, it sounded like an anesthetic put him to sleep.
Right. And Jonah seems to have administered a dose of that anesthetic to himself here.
Okay.
So he's sort of, it's not, like I say, it's not the usual word for sleep. So it suggests something that a little funny is up, along with this language of going down. What about this evil? I wonder about this. So at the end, the sailors say to each other, come, let's cast lot. We can figure out who's bringing this evil to us. Because I mentioned earlier that this word evil comes up. So first you've got the evil of Nineveh coming up before God. Here we get another mention of the word evil. Where is this coming from? The lot falls on Jonah, and for a time, I think we say, aha, Jonah is the source of the evil. But who threw the great wind? Who sent the storm?
The captain thinks it's Jonah's God.
Yes. But I wonder, the text is pretty clear that Yahweh's the one who hurled the wind, right? Mm-hmm. And I think it's kind of interesting that when we read this, we say, well, that's Jonah's fault. And we don't say, God, you being God and having all these powers, you need to throw a storm at this ship and threaten the lives of all these sailors in order to get your prophet to do your bidding. So I wonder if throughout this story, there's an ethical question being raised by the sort of repetition of this word evil. We can test and see if that theory holds as we read on. But God is not, I think, let completely off the hook here. But again, we'll see if that reading is persuasive or not as we go on. Other things here?
Amy, just a question that may be obvious and you probably deal with in your book, but was this whole story of Jonah probably written by the original author in the order that it was to lead us through these questions and these issues, like you would like a rabbi would with a Jewish student, to teach him these issues one after another? Was the story constructed with that in mind?
Yeah, well, that's a really great question. Feel free to throw out big questions, because I didn't give you any real introduction to the kind of basic issues of the book, when it was written, anything like that. So throw those in as we go. Thanks for that. Yeah, actually, one of the supports for the argument that I make that this is a book of questions, that it generates more questions than it answers, is the way that reading communities worked in post-exilic Israel. So most likely the book was written in the post-exilic period. So that's like round about 400 BCE, which is late in terms of texts in the Hebrew Bible. And the kinds of literature that these reading communities, these proto-rabbis basically, the kinds of literature that they used, enjoyed, and produced was the kind of literature that you could play with in this very way. Texts that raised, that created space for debate, because if you've ever worked with rabbis or done, say, a Bible study with Jews, like they love to argue. And the point is the dialogue. The point is the debate. So they never want to come to a resolution. And that's true in the Talmud and in the Mishnah. So that, yes, we want a text that can let us debate and have a debate in which nobody has to win, because that's, that it's for dialogue, it's for argument.
And Amy, picking up on Steve's comments too, and what you were just saying, you listen to rabbis and they make a good use of humor and satire. And certainly you were doing this in your lecture this evening here. They intermingle satire and humor as learning tools to get across the message that they're trying to communicate.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So, yeah, and I think if we understand satire in the sense that everything is really up for a kind of humorous take, then I think that's absolutely right. And that's a really important kind of teaching tool, because in part, what it's asking readers to do, this community of readers, is to not take themselves quite so seriously, to see themselves as players, as people who play with the text, which is not to say that the questions aren't serious, but that it allows space for people to laugh and to kind of laugh at their own situation, laugh at their own foibles, laugh at their own strangeness, the precarity of their situation, which I think creates space for creativity in a way that some of that sort of serious top-down preaching from the pulpit, deliverance of doctrine kind of stuff can do. So it's a very, see, I grew up, I'm a pastor's kid, so I guess I've got issues with authority, particularly pastoral authority. But it's a different kind of teaching, as you say. I'm really glad you pointed that out, because it really empowers the readers. And I think if you have interacted with contemporary Jews, they read their Bibles, they know Hebrew, they study constantly. People who take them, I know that there are non-religious Jews who don't do that, but people who are parts of Jewish congregations take the study of the text really seriously, and they see it as their duty to enter into debate about the text. That's not for somebody to impose on them. That's for them to do themselves. So I guess they were sort of, proto Lutherans in this way.
Well, it allows everybody in earshot to look at the text with a polyvalent lens. You get to see other points of view that you may not have thought about.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And as soon as we try to pin the text down and make it mean one thing, we miss out on this way of interacting with the sacred text, which I think ideally is about opening us up, is about allowing us to question and to be in disagreement. I mean, this is the other thing I think, and maybe I'm caricaturing mainline Protestants here. Again, I'm a traumatized preacher's kid, so forgive me if I'm preacher. But and you can come back and question me on this.
Amy,
but yeah.
do the Jews ever look at a story like this as being a literal historical retelling of a real story, or is it always a metaphorical story meant to teach and provide debate?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question. Because of course they don't tell us that in a straightforward way. Like, so ancient commentary on texts will not always talk about whether they think, what kind of a story they think it is. That's sort of a modern thing, right? That we want to know what genre and that kind of thing. But I think that they thought that while this is a fantastical story, it is, I think they think it's, you know, in the pre-modern period, I think they took God's word for it, or at least they interact with it as if. They don't ask the kinds of questions, but that said, they don't ask the kinds of rational, modern questions that we would ask. So they're not like guy in a fish belly for 3 days. Like they're just rolling with it. They're like, sure, absolutely, why not? You know, so they're lying between fantasy, fiction, nonfiction. They're just a little more open to all of that being true at the same time.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, they don't start fussing about it until the modern period. So around about the 16th century or so, Christian interpreters in particular become obsessed with what kind of a whale was Jonah inside of. And so they're really looking hard for candidates that have big enough, capacious enough bellies to accommodate a human being. And they're, you know, interviewing sailors and hearing stories about how people got swallowed by whales and were regurgitated and lived to tell the tale. So yes, there was an obsession with proving the historical veracity of this tale, starting in about the 16th century.
The pesky scientific method.
Exactly, I know. So much easier if you say it's a story. Yeah. Other thoughts, questions about this part?
Yeah, Amy, so you might know Dr. Roy Heller at Perkins. He was my Old Testament professor there, and he always used to pound this into us. He always used to say that, you know, these stories that we hear in Hebrew scripture are kind of like the stories we hear from our crazy uncle at the family reunion. And he said, you know, that when we hear the crazy story at the family reunion, his first reaction is, why is my crazy uncle telling me this story, right? Like, I'm not worried about the accuracy of the story, right? I want to know why he felt like he had to tell me this. Like, what am I supposed to hear? You know, and that's always helped me when I've approached these tales in the Hebrew scriptures, you know, is why did the writers feel like they needed to tell this story to me? Like what am I supposed to glean from this? I'm not going to get too worried about the details.
Right.
Right.
And it can help us to track back and forth between different kinds of stories and that kind of thing to try to understand the genre. But yeah, I think ultimately the question is, what's the wisdom in this? And when your uncle is crazy, it may not be immediately clear what the wisdom is that's embedded in this story. My father is a big storyteller. He's not crazy, at least not yet. Well, he's a little crazy. But he tells stories about this little rural town that he grew up in Illinois. And it's the same kind of thing where you don't really know if it's true, factually speaking, but it's communicating something really important to you about usually the nature of community. There's some little bit of wisdom usually in there about that. So.
And also we can think in terms of one of our most famous novels of all time, Herman Melville's Moby Dick, and Captain Ahab and his his obsession with the great white whale, taunted and tormented. So there's some parallels between that great epic novel and certainly Jonah in some ways, wouldn't you think?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I have a chapter on that actually. So yeah, there are, oh my gosh, I have too many things in my brain, obviously. The preacher, the Presbyterian preacher on board delivers a long sermon about Jonah, which sort of reveals him to be the object or the target of Melville's satire. So he preaches this very fiery sort of Calvin-esque sort of sermon, John Edwards kind of sermon about Jonah, and it's Melville's way of poking fun at this preacher. But yeah, all kinds of interesting parallels with Moby Dick, definitely.
Just a question, is Melville's book When the Dag Gadol Became a Whale?
It's actually, that's Jerome, who translated the Hebrew into Latin in the 4th century. So he's the reason we end up with a whale instead of a big fish. Maybe a little bit by way of Greek too. So Greek has this word ketos, which kind of means, it has a more mythological connotation to it. So when we see all these images of sea monsters in early Christian catacombs and sarcophagi, they don't look like fish either. So people are definitely catching on to the fact that there are mythological implications here in terms of the fish's identity. Good. Okay. Should we go to the next one or more questions? I'd much rather talk than lead us forward. I mean, whatever questions. I'd rather field the questions that you have than impose my own on you.
Well, wasn't the goddess Tiamat the sort of the enemy of Yahweh in mythological terms?
Yeah. So the goddess Tiamat, for those who aren't familiar with her, features in the creation story of the Babylonians called the Enuma Elish. And Tiamat is the old watery mother goddess who basically is getting poor performance reviews from the council of deities. They think that she and her consort are lazy and they want a new champion. They want a new chief of the gods. And so they elect Marduk, who battles with Tiamat and defeats her and becomes chief god. And so the thinking is that Genesis 1, when it begins, God's ruach, God's breath, hovers over the face of the deep, that's Tehom in Hebrew, which is cognitively related to Tiamat, so that there's a reference to God's somewhat adversarial relationship with the sea there, with the deep. And so the sea and the deep feature as enemies of God in a lot of texts, but I think here in this text, by the time we get to this later period in Israel's history, at least from the perspective of the book's composition, you have more of a traditional view of the God of Israel being the God of all the world. So I think that's the other thing that's coming up in the book of Jonah is like, what does it mean for our God, our meaning Israel's God, to also be the God of the whole world? Like, what happens to our special relationship if God has also got to look out for the Assyrian Empire? Like, that sucks. How is that going to work? So when God is perceived as easily managing and ordering the Tehom, the deep, in Genesis 1, it's thought to be a sort of one-upmanship of Marduk. So God doesn't even have to break a sweat in order to defeat the waters of chaos. In other texts, God is fighting quite hard against the waters of chaos, and it's a kind of ongoing epic battle until later. So in a text like Jonah, I think what we see here is God is no longer having to compete with the sea. God is now Lord of all. God controls the sea, God controls the wind, God controls the fish. That's the language when it says, Yahweh designated or appointed a big fish. So all of these kinds of epic enemies of God are in Jonah sort of downgraded. So the other thing is the big fish is also a reference to the mythological sea that Yahweh has to battle into Tiamat. But here is just a big fish who basically takes orders from God.
Quick question is, prior to this, was God El Shaddai before he became Yahweh? I mean, I'm trying to figure out why they use Yahweh here.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's an interesting question too. So all kinds of names for God in the Hebrew Bible, and El Shaddai appears in, just trying to catch everybody up. El Shaddai appears in Genesis and in some Psalms. So the thinking goes that Yahweh was originally associated with El, who was the chief god of the Canaanite pantheon. So, and this is the sort of father god figure, and known to, at least according to Genesis, the early ancestors of Israel. And in terms of the way the Hebrew Bible was put together, the introduction of Yahweh by the name Yahweh is supposed to formally begin in Exodus 3. So when Moses gets to the burning bush and Yahweh then introduces himself by this new name, which is I am who I am, I will be who I will be, this sort of crazy verb name. But people who were writing earlier didn't necessarily know that God doesn't introduce himself until Exodus 3. So you have these kind of names that are circulating alongside one another. And so it's not clear whether there's like a historical development around this, probably not. Probably some communities liked one name, others liked other names. So that's a not very straightforward answer to your question.
Amy, I have maybe a question here. It starts out with this just unequivocal sense that Jonah hears the voice of God. And I guess my question is more of discernment. You read it in the Old Testament, it's very clear to Jonah that this was the voice of God, when I think our human condition is far from that. You know, maybe he thought he was crazy and he was running away from something that was, I don't know. There's a lot of humanness in Jonah that I think, and you see here, the first, Yahweh hurls the great winds upon the seas, he sends the whale, and yet the people on the boat see that as somebody bringing evil upon them. And how, that's the question of discernment. How do we know when we hear the voice of God?
Yeah, no, that's a question that the Israelites wrestled with as well. And although not so much how do we know when we hear the voice of God, but how do we know which prophets to trust? How do we know a true prophet from a false prophet? Because of course, there were prophets all over the ancient world, and they were often delivering messages that were at odds with one another. So one of the litmus tests for a prophet is he's telling you something you don't want to hear, which is fascinating, right? So I wonder if that helps us kind of think about the voice of God, right? So if it's telling you what you want to hear, maybe not.
Yeah, but I've heard a lot of things I don't want to hear lately, but I wouldn't call them prophets either.
Yeah. There's a great book by James Kugel called The Great Shift. And he talks about the minds of the ancients as having a more permeable membrane between themselves and the divine realm, so that we kind of hear this voice maybe inside of ourselves that we try to identify as a divine voice or a wise voice or something. They were quite certain that there were members of their community who could absolutely hear the voice of God.
Okay.
So it's kind of fascinating to think that partly because of how we've been conditioned in the modern sort of, scientific worldview, not that I'm against the scientific worldview, but it closes off a lot of possibilities for us, so that we say, oh, I must be crazy, right? Because who hears the voice of God? That's not possible. Whereas for the ancients, they were like, yeah, absolutely. That was God calling right here, right now. All right, you're gonna have to tell me what time it is because I can't see my clock on my computer, which is kind of crazy. How much time do we have, Jill?
It's 8 o'clock right now.
It's
So
8 o'clock. Wow, it's a good thing I asked. I had no idea.
Yeah, sorry, I wasn't watching either.
No, no worries. This is what happens when you go on full screen and I'm like, oh my gosh, I didn't bring my phone up here. Okay.
And it's when so interesting too. Yes.
Oh, good, good. I'm glad you found it so. Okay, so let me get this, see if I can get this thing off of here so I can see you again. Now.
if you go down to the bottom of your Zoom screen, a little window, a little box should pop up, a menu option is for share screen, and you can stop your share there. Or at the very top of your screen, you can stop the share.
Oh, there it is.
Yeah.
Okay. My little toolbar went away up at the top.
There you go.
Phew. Okay. All right. Well, so Walter Brueggemann was my teacher at Columbia and the person who inspired me to become a biblical scholar. And he used to say, well, we didn't get through what we wanted to get through, but we were doing Bible, so we did good work. So that's what I've always embraced. I'd rather talk about the questions that come up for us and go down, whatever lane we're going down. As long as we're talking about Bible, I'm happy. I hope you are too. I hope you didn't feel like, oh my gosh, we only got through 7 verses with Dr. Erickson.
No, that's fine.
Yeah, well, we are fascinated. This is wonderful. We'll really look forward to next week.
Great, great. Look forward to seeing you again. Bye.
Thank you.